Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a slightly different video. Today we're going to take a micro view on one of the positions in FPL. We're going to look at the best budget midfielders. Now I tend to do a cheat sheet series, which is a bit more macro, looking at sort of different price points and kind of my tiers of players. But I wanted to do a deep dive into the best budget midfielders because a lot of people and our drafts, of course, we're in a position where we have players like Sarr and Palmer locked in. Some people obviously are on non-Sarr drafts, and that's fine. But I think all of us almost have 2 to 3 midfielders that are quite expensive locked in. Like if you like Saka over Palmer, that's fine. You have him in your team. If you have Bruno in your team, that probably means you're also looking in search of a budget midfielder. So the purpose of this video really is looking at the best budget midfielders and then kind of evaluating what are my favorite players from each price point and exactly why there is. Because part of the value towards these players is they get points in different means, right? There are some DEFCON midfielders now in the game that are in these price ranges. There are also some players who are very cheap who could have some open play value, but their minutes risks are there. And so you kind of get this ebb and flow of you can get points, you can potentially not if the player shows up or doesn't, versus some players who might have a really high floor and a much lower ceiling. So that's kind of the gist of the video. I think we're also going to support a lot of the analysis using the Fantasy Football Hub player projections. I actually have access towards the Pro Tool, so I'll be sharing some of the sort of data that you can get even up to, let's say, 8 game weeks at a time worth of data for the sort of player point projections. If you want to have a look at the projections yourself across maybe other price points, other positions, have a look at the link in the description below. That will just take you straight towards the player point projections, and you can kind of see the sort of level of data that I'm looking at. It's looking at fixture quality, it's looking at how many points projected over a sort of run of games. What I'd like to say is that I'm looking at the 5.5, the 6.0, and the 6.5 tier. The best 5.5 the best 5 million midfielder to me is Granit Xhaka. I don't really think there's even a need to mention that. Fantasy Football Hub actually has really good projections for Xhaka as well, so he does seem like a very standout 5.0. In the next tier, obviously at the 5.5s, this is where I think we actually have some sort of bone to that sort of discussion. Elliot Anderson is the one. I mean, he's featured in a lot of my drafts. A lot of people have incorporated Anderson in their teams as well. But I also see, a lot of takes, which is that people are pessimistic around Anderson. And I think what I have to say is that the DEFCONs are very real. If you look at someone and you think, let's say he's got a floor of, let's say, 38 or sort of 4 points per match, but is actually someone who's very capable of getting that. I mean, 38 times 4, that's 152 points over the course of a season. I'm not saying that Elliot Anderson is going to be a 4 point per game player. That's clearly not going to happen because even though he actually has some of the best DEFCON averages within the game, within the midfield, especially when you look at last season's stats, he's still going to have games where he doesn't. He undershoots that because what my friend did, which he actually looked at every single Premier League player instance last season and looked at the kind of DEFCON distribution, and he found out that it was a normal distribution. So our kind of regular math, I guess, around distributions very much apply. So there's a pretty much high chance that, let's say, someone like Elliot Anderson is going to get a 60-70% chance as long as he plays 90 minutes or roughly like 80 plus minutes a game to be able to get that sort of 2-point threshold. And then after that, all you need him to do is get some open play goals, maybe here and there, to get as many assists as he got last season, which was 7. Which are really good numbers, actually, for someone at this sort of price range. If you're going to add almost, I guess, like artificially, like 5 points per game, 1.2 points per game, that is quite amazing. And so no surprise that the kind of hub model has Anderson rated as the top pick. And when I actually sort specifically for the 5.5 picks, I mean, as of the time of writing right now, he's the second best because Xhaka's sort of leading right now. But I tend to think that Xhaka won't be able to sort of reproduce the numbers that we kind of predict for him because for reasons like maybe Sunderland's a much weaker team, he might be able to get, for example, things like DEFCONs, but he would really have to have something like penalties, for example, for me to be so sold on Granit Xhaka. I just think that he's not going to be as consistent as someone like Elliot Anderson, where at least when you look at last season's data, this is Elliot Anderson from Nottingham Forest playing for Nottingham Forest once again this season. Do I think it's more reproducible? Yes. So I kind of feel like the numbers make a lot more sense. And so Elliot Anderson being at the top of the 5.5s is no surprise. So he's my number one, but I actually think the other picks might be better. But this is once again taking a leap of faith. The pick that I'm going to mention as second in terms of the 5.5 tier is clearly going to be Daniel Malen. He's had a really good preseason so far. So the context for him is that last season he kind of came into this Aston Villa team in the sort of January market as well as a signing, and Asensio and Rashford actually ended up getting much more minutes than him. He himself was actually more of a sort of periphery type player. He played a substitution type role in most games, playing 15 to 25 minutes per match. In the preseason so far, though, we've seen a little bit of an uptick in that. We've seen 45, and I think around 60 for the minutes so far, which is a huge positive because no one's been really thrown into a lot of minutes outside of someone like Watkins or Rodgers. So from that perspective, I think when you look at the Aston Villa core, who's going to be leading the line this season and who's going to be sort of supporting and anchoring in sort of wing positions or even the 10 position like Rodgers plays in. I tend to think that, of course, Leon Bailey's depth in the right wing position. You've got someone like, let's say, Jake Ramsey who can play on the left. But Maitland could actually very much start the season on sort of both the left and the right hand positions. And he can even cover sometimes, as we've seen, that sort of center forward position as a substitute to Watkins. So I feel like Maitland now actually has really good expected minutes within this team. Do I think there are any more than, let's say, 65, 70 minutes per match? No, I think he's going to be subbed off early, unless he, let's say, performs really well to start and is able to sort of lock down a position in the team. That's kind of where I have Maitland at. And interesting, the markets, I think, support this sort of opinion. The markets actually have Maitland locked down with a season-long goals of 7.75. That is extremely high compared to some of the sort of top 7.0, even 6.5 midfielders. Not many midfielders are actually at this level, right? So it's really impressive that Maitland has these numbers. And I think all we have to do is believe that he's going to start the season with good minutes alongside Aston Villa's good fixtures for him to be a good pick. So I feel like he's a punt where if he starts the season with really good minutes and he doesn't lose his spot in the team, he's going to be better than Elliot Anderson. That's true. But you also kind of have to play the flip side of the coin. He could very much be someone who maybe starts a game, doesn't have a great performance in game week 1, plays slightly less minutes in game week 2, and then by game week 3, he's on the bench for whatever reason, and Leon Bailey might have assumed the starting position in the right wing role. And so that's kind of my concern sort of with Maitland, and it could also happen, of course, equally if he's going to play on the left. So that's kind of, I think, the flip side of the coin. But is it worth sort of taking the punt on Maitland? Once again, I think it comes down to things like team structure as well. If you, let's say, have a 4.5 forward, you can't really bank on, let's say, the Maitland position being too wrong, because if it goes poorly, you suddenly have to use the transfer on a 5.5 million player, and you might not really have wanted to do that in terms of the long-term planning of things. Do you have more transfers this season? Yes, you do, and maybe that's a pro. So that's maybe why you want Maitland in your draft. The third pick that I actually have in the 5.5 position is going to be Ndiaye Reinders. He had an exceptional season at AC Milan. His underlying stats are really good. When you compare it to someone like Maitland, for example, Maitland is just far clear of anyone in this sort of price point and category. But of course, that's per 90 numbers, and Maitland, I don't think right now is a 90-minute player. Reinders could very well be a 90-minute player. He missed the first game in the Club World Cup for Man City, but then in game weeks 2, 3, and also in the first groups or the first knockout game versus Al Hilal, he actually ended up playing 90 minutes in each match, including going into extra time versus Al Hilal. So what I find interesting is Rodri didn't play too many games in the Club World Cup, but he did play a match where he did start alongside Reinders, and therefore you can see Reinders can play, of course, alongside Rodri, which obviously was the plan anyways, because Rodri was going to come into the season. I think that the key thing when you look at, let's say, Man City is, I think a good analysis to almost set an initial expectation of Man City is Luke's analysis of what this prospective sort of game week 1 looking Man City core of the team looks like, right? It's something like Doku on the left, Haaland playing center forward, a kind of 10 like a Foden, like a Marmoush, and then supported by someone like Reinders, for example, who could also be Gundo at times maybe, and then sort of, pinned by, let's say, Rodri in the defense mid position. Kovacic as well can come back into the team and provide some depth at some point in time. And then the right wing is most likely going to be a Savio, maybe even a Bernardo Silva at times. So that's kind of, I think, the core. Of course, you've got players like Cherki who can easily play on the right and in the 10 spot. And then Reinders can even arguably sometimes play in a bit more of a defensive setup, where, let's say, if he doesn't play with an offensive 10, he plays almost 2 midfielders, and I think he did that for Al Hilal. He played something like Gundo plus, let's say, Bernardo and also Reinders. So that can be the setup. But I think Reinders was sort of mimicking what would be a little bit more of a holding role in that game. So, but he can still play 2 defensive-ish, kind of, or more defensive 10s compared to, let's say, the classic Marmoush, the classic Fodens of the world. So that's kind of what my thoughts are on Reinders. I think he can start the season really good minutes, and the open play number is going to be better than Elliot Anderson. So he's almost the sweet spot in the middle between, let's say, an Anderson and a Daniel Malen, where he probably actually has better minutes than Malen to start off with. And he actually has better sort of open play numbers than Anderson. But the key thing that I think a lot of people still miss here is that even though Anderson might not be the most interesting pick in open play, the whole point of Anderson is that he's going to give you the permanence of minutes. And really the defensive contribution data is there. Last season was probably his best season in terms of defensive contributions, but he hasn't played that many full seasons of sort of full flight football. So I think that basis is actually good enough for me to think, okay, that was actually the one season of sample size within Nottingham Forest. Do I trust that more than the previous season's data? And if I do, then Anderson is even better of a pick than I think, because he actually gets the DEFCONs, at a much higher rate than any of the other midfielders in the game, right? So this is including someone like Caicedo, who just simply played more matches than him and more 90s. And if Anderson is able to play more 90s this season, I would expect for him to be able to get more DEFCON points over the course of the full year. So that's kind of also a slight leap of faith as well. So I feel like Anderson's has the best minutes. Is it perfect? No. And then it's Rangers, then it's Malin. But does Malin have the most sort of attacking edge? Yes. But the way that I'd rate them is exactly in that sort of list of order. Another thing with Rangers that I think is interesting is, I mean, you can always just wait and see with a team like Man City. We're expecting a huge improvement for Man City this season, but is it going to happen by game week 1? Not necessarily, right? So City is also a team where we can maybe give them a little bit of time to take over, where they don't have, I think, the best fixtures in the world. You can kind of wait for, let's say, Anderson to play out some good games. You can wait for a Malin to play out his good games before you actually move eventually into someone like Rangers, if his minutes make a lot of sense. Let's move on to the next tier anyways, in the 6 million tier. I actually think that the 6 million tier is very interesting because it does require you to almost take a little bit of a leap of faith in certain players. And at the same time, I think there's a lot of guarantees as well. My favorite player in the tier is probably going to be Paqueta. Paqueta is actually someone who just has everything, right? With the ban being overturned or, not being provided to him, he's someone who now has access to DEFCON points, which actually he is really, really good at. He's better than any of the other midfielders that I've mentioned. If you look at last season's numbers, so better than Tielemans just slightly, and better than some of the open play type of attackers, which is obviously, it just makes sense, right? Him being really good at that is a huge pro. He's on penalties for West Ham, and as long as he plays good minutes, he's going to get a share of those penalties. And I think that's massive. And that pretty much sells Paqueta to me because his underlying stats are much worse than, let's say, some of the Brighton kind of midfielders that I have in this list. But at the same time, they're still arguably at the same tier as someone like a Tielemans. The big difference with someone like Tielemans is I think his minutes are slightly better. He's still a little bit more creative, for example, than, let's say, Paqueta is. When you look at last season's numbers, Paqueta actually had one of his worst seasons to date. So that's not a positive sign. I think it also kind of requires you to take a small leap of faith in terms of if West Ham can get a bit better and he gets a little bit more of a share of goals and assists, is he going to benefit through that way? And I think Paqueta very much does. Tielemans is going to be my third pick, which means that Jorginho actually is going to be my second pick. The reason why I quite like Jorginho a lot is actually, I mean, all you have to kind of look at is the season-long goal tallies for someone who's actually, a part of the sort of open play category of things, right? He's someone who actually has 7 projected goals season long, which is actually a little bit higher than someone like Paqueta, but of course he's not so good at the DEFCON aspect of things. I think Brighton also actually have a very similar fixture run to West Ham. So if you were starting the season, I actually think that they're quite similar because West Ham have pretty bad fixtures in game week 6 and 7. I think that's Everton and Arsenal back to back, whereas let's say Brighton actually have a really poor game week 6 fixture as well, which is going to be Chelsea away. With that sort of being context, I'd probably take the player with all the intangibles with Paqueta. And then I'd go to Jorginho, where I think, yes, Brighton are probably going to kick on this season. He's someone who's going to benefit as well with João Pedro leaving, where his minutes going to be better. We know that Jorginho can sort of play the right wing position. We've seen him play as the 10. Sometimes we've also seen him sort of play almost as a false 9 to start off with. So I think with Welbeck not expected to play as many minutes as we think, even though he's been a game week 1 option for a lot of people, I think the idea is Jorginho is almost a key piece. He's someone that this team has spent a lot of money over, and I would expect him to just have really good minutes this season and just benefit from that. So I have Jorginho as my second pick here. The reason why I don't actually have Tielemans as almost my first or second pick is mostly because I think it does require you to take a leap of faith with Tielemans. Why do I say that? Tielemans is someone who, unfortunately, when you look at, let's say, I think the quality of him as a player, his XAG is really good. The XG is not there, so he's going to be far short of the Brighton mids in that aspect, and even against someone like a Paqueta. And with that being context, I think you almost have to believe that Tielemans is on penalties for him to be a good pick. But it can go both sides of the coin. If he's actually on penalties for Aston Villa, and I'll talk about the penalty taking order in a minute, if he's on penalties, I think he is the best 6.0. But I don't think he is, personally, which is why I have him in this tier here. What I don't like about Tielemans is there's a lot of the 5.5 mids like Elliot Anderson who have kind of no cons to them, right? They just consistently shell out points on average per match. And why do you have to spend an additional 0.5 to get Tielemans into your team? I don't really buy it unless you really believe he's on penalties. So that's kind of my take. Another sort of, I guess, tidbit on Tielemans is he's someone who I think has some of the best fixtures to start with, right? So if you don't want to spend the money on Rodgers, but you want to have some sort of cover on Aston Villa, I guess that's the logic behind Tielemans. But you can already see I'm a little bit sour on it. I think, as I said, at the end of the day, it comes down to this penalty share thing. What was the sort of pecking order for Aston Villa last season? So Tielemans actually took the first penalty, I think, at around October time. He actually missed it. And then actually Watkins had to go on penalties. So Watkins ended up scoring 2 penalties, I think, between, let's say, November and December. And then he actually ended up missing a penalty versus Celtic in the Champions League in January. And that kind of took him out of the pecking order as well. So Tielemans was 0-1. Watkins was 2-1. And then eventually Asensio and Rashford took the rest of the penalties for the season. So when Asensio actually missed his brace of penalties within one of the matches, what Unai Emery actually mentioned was that the pecking order was going to be Rashford, then Asensio, then actually in third place, a mixture of Watkins, McGinn, and Tielemans. And for me, that's not good enough, right? That basically suggests that maybe now, of course, with Asensio and Rashford leaving the club, that Tielemans has maybe a 30% penalty share, but you can't really take that almost as a projection going forwards. You almost have to either believe, I think, either he does a penalty share or he doesn't, and he's maybe a little bit of an overestimated player or an underestimated player. So if he's on penalties, I think Tielemans is the best 610 flat out. But I tend to believe that maybe Watkins will actually just get to have another chance at being the penalty taker of the team. Or maybe McGinn will actually get his chance because he didn't actually miss a penalty so far. So why can't he take it as the captain of the club? So that's kind of my take in terms of, unfortunately, Tielemans. I don't think he's a penalty taker of the team. Therefore, I'm kind of having him as third here. But I still think he's going to have a productive season. He's always going to give you the minutes guarantees. And he does really have a great start of the season. Minteh could be my fourth pick. And interestingly, I think Minteh and Jorginho could maybe even end up being the best 6.0s. Because when you look at this Brighton team with João Pedro leaving the club, only Gruda is the only player who I think consistently will take away minutes from all the other players that I've mentioned, like a Jorginho and a Minteh. I think Minteh has probably less positional share. I did seemingly hear that he might have played a preseason match as a false 9 versus Southampton, but I don't think that's really true, sort of looking back at the analysis of it. I think they just sort of played almost like a 4-2-4 type of formation, and I think Minteh was still playing right wing. But Minteh was actually a player last year who had a really strong season. When you look at the underlying stats, they're actually very, very solid. And interestingly, he's actually the best Brighton midfielder when it comes to CBIT. So if Minteh actually had as much minutes as Jorginho, maybe I would change my mind in terms of the pecking order that I've created here. But I think Minteh is probably less likely to get the most goals. And I think the markets actually back sort of my analysis up. The markets have Minteh at 5.5 and Rutter at 7, which kind of makes sense with sort of logic that I'm going at here. Part of it too is maybe if Rutter's going to play more central this season, which I think is what we expect, he's going to have probably better positional share when it comes to getting goals consistently. So that's kind of why I really like Jorginho at this point in time. And Minteh is going to be my 4.6.0. Once again, Brighton and West Ham have some really good games to start with and some poor games in Game Week 6. With the sort of really popular 3-at-6 strategy, I actually think it could be interesting having these players in your draft because they're also going to have extremely low ownership and a lot of people are sort of missing on them, right? So that's going to be my 6.0 tier. As far as the 6.5 tier, I think this is the tier that I find the most interesting. And we haven't shown some sort of Fantasy Football Hub projections in a minute, but what I find interesting is actually when you look at, let's say, the 6.5 tier in Fantasy Football Hub, the player that's actually rated the absolute highest is Declan Rice. I have to be honest and say I'm not really sure why that is. I think maybe it's just a case of the Arsenal attacks is extremely well rated by the AI algorithm that Fantasy Football Hub have. Do I believe that Rice is going to have an absolutely transformational season as an attacker? I don't really think so, if I'm being quite honest. I think Zubimendi obviously is a huge plus. It allows Rice to sort of play much more advanced. And I think what we learned last season was that this Arsenal team is actually better with Rice playing in a more advanced centre-mid role. But do I think that he's going to have an explosive season to the point where he's going to have more goals than some of the other wingers? Not really. And that's sort of my hot take, I suppose, for this episode. I tend to think he's probably going to be less attacking than still the other players in this tier, right? Which is going to be Sarr, Ndiaye, and Mitoma. On top of that, of course, I think the most value that Rice carries is as the set piece taker of the team. He's an extremely lethal set piece taker on half of the set pieces that Arsenal have, and arguably most of the free kicks that they have now. So maybe a little bit more than 50% of the set piece share is now his, which is a huge pro. But I still think you can't predict for that many goals this season. And I think the market analysis backs that up with Rice in 5.2.5. So I would actually have Rice as my fourth pick before I jump into sort of my preferred picks. And as I said, though, the Fantasy Football Hub does have him as the best rated player in this tier. And I could be absolutely wrong, and I'm happy to be wrong about this. I've gone against models previously, so this is, I guess, my version of it. So yeah, that's Rice for you. I actually prefer in this tier the most, I like Ndiaye. I think Ndiaye actually gives you everything you want from being a penalty taker, from playing really consistent minutes. Under Sean Dyche, was actually someone who actually played much more minutes than he did under Moyes, but I think part of the reason why his minutes were a little bit reduced under Moyes was because he was coming back from the sort of meniscus injury that he had. And so he was sort of managed, I think, up until the end of the season. His substitutions kind of came at 70, 77. So obviously when we look at the DEFCON per 90 stats, it's not really fair to use the per 90 stats and almost assume that that's going to be what Ndiaye is going to be doing per match, because he's not necessarily a 90-minute player, but he could be, right? He's still, to me, the most important Everton player that they have. And even though they're in the market for players like Kieran Dewsbury-Hall and Tyler Dibbling, I still think he's going to play really, really good minutes this season. And I have absolutely zero doubt that he will. So that's kind of my opening take on Ndiaye. I think, as I said, when you compare to some of the other wingers in this tier or even the tier below, he's kind of in a league of his own, right? That sort of 11 DEFCON contributions per game is much higher than Sarr, much higher than Mitoma, also higher than some of the 6.0s that we've mentioned in open play, or even let's say a Malin. So that's kind of where I'm at with Ndiaye as well. I think you just have to add some value towards being a penalty taker. And I also think he's going to kick on a little bit, right? So the season-long averages that he had last year were really poor. A lot of people are going to point out that his XG was really, really mediocre. And I think that's fair. But I think Everton also have a pretty good fixture run to start the season outside of the Arsenal away game. And then I also have to say that what's nice with Ndiaye, I suppose, is the numbers under Moyes were actually much more positive when it comes to sort of the rolling averages of his NPXG, of his XAG as well. So I think that's a huge pro towards Ndiaye. And that's also why in my tier list, the second and third spot is between Sarr and Mitoma. I previously had Sarr within my first draft, but as you can see within my most recent videos, I've actually progressively taken Sarr out of my teams, right? When I shared my latest draft, which was actually on the live stream that I did last week, I took Sarr out of the draft, and part of it's because I found it really hard to sort of reconcile how poor the opening fixture run was. Games like Chelsea away, games like Aston Villa away, I really don't like. Yes, of course, they have Sunderland at home, but there's still even matches like Liverpool in there, and I do think that Sarr just generally has a slightly worse fixture run than Mitoma. Interestingly, what I like about Mitoma is that a lot of us are kind of eyeing up a free hit 6. You can kind of get rid of Mitoma's best game, which is going to be Chelsea away in free hit 6 as well, and if you don't free hit, I suppose that is going to be a bad game, but so does Sarr, right? Sarr literally has Chelsea away in game week 1. So to me, there's not too much to separate between. Interestingly, the Fantasy Football Hub algorithm has Sarr as 38.9 over 8 game weeks, Minteh at 35.5, and Mitoma a little bit less at 35.4. I wonder if ever so slightly that part of the reason why Mitoma's metrics are a little bit lower is simply because his minutes are a little bit less. Because if you look at the points per start metric that Sarr, Mitoma, and Minteh have, Mitoma's actually top in this list. And I think maybe what's happened here is that the model might have just projected that Mitoma is going to have slightly less minutes, because if you look at the end of last season, Mitoma was playing on this kind of maybe like NBA/NFL type minutes restriction, which meant that he was only playing as a substitute, playing 25 to 30 to 40 minutes per game, as opposed to, when he's playing full on matches as a starter. So I think that's part of the reason why the algorithm actually has him with less expected points. I think if actually you probably match the level of sort of minutes that Sarr and Mitoma have, it's more likely that Mitoma will actually sort of pip out someone like Sarr, which is quite impressive, because I think we thought that Sarr was most likely going to be the most explosive player across the board in this sort of price point. And when I look at the market projections, interestingly, Mitoma has more season-long goals compared to Sarr at 7.75 to 7.25. And Mitoma is, of course, the best Brighton midfielder as well, based on the season-long goal projections. So that's kind of why I've leaned towards Mitoma now. I really like Mitoma, and I might even revisit Mitoma within my draft at the 6.5 tier, whereas Sarr is actually at third in 6.5. And then unfortunately Declan Rice, who I don't know why, but I just don't have necessarily the same faith as everyone else. And part of this is because when you look at the DEFCON numbers for Declan Rice, he doesn't fit the mold that people are looking for, where he's getting a lot of defensive contributions. I think the more advanced he plays, in theory, the less defensive contributions he's going to have. So that's taking away value from that. And if you think he's more advanced, obviously that's a pro from the offensive point of view, but that also, as I said, takes away that sort of floor of points that you get from DEFCON. And he's not sort of an anomaly like Ndiaye is, where Ndiaye was actually playing mostly, I think, consistently, almost like a center mid, sort of left mid type position under Sean Dyche, but then actually still managed to rack up really, really good ball recovery numbers, playing a little bit higher for Moyes. So that's kind of my tier list of the best budget midfielders. I hope that was informative for you. I hope that kind of helps you fill some gaps within your teams. As I said, a lot of things are subject to sort of risk appetite as well, right? If you are going for someone like Malin, you know what that means in terms of, I could be sort of bringing in someone like an Nkunku type in my team, because maybe he could start in game week 1, he could start in game week 2, but by game week 3 he could be out of the team. He could be sort of a bench periphery option. I think that is possible for someone like Malin, less possible for some of the other picks that I've mentioned in this in this sort of best budget midfielders video, and that's kind of it. So thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.